So yeah, this is great. I'm so excited about this. We had this fantastic conversation back before COVID. And it was, Akram, you were working on your film, Extreme Combat. My book, Risk, Failure, Play, had just come out. And we were both kind of thinking about this relationship between martial arts, sport, violence, play, creativity, and like the lines between those things. So I guess if we could just begin, like, since I got to hear your thoughts before the film, but I haven't afterwards, if you could talk about your experience of making the film, of making Extreme Combat, and reflecting on some insights.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I had no kind of my expectations were shattered. I'm a dreamer. And so when I went into it, I went into it with a certain expectation, and everything was shattered because the reason I really connected with it was because there's a huge element of truth in the sport. There's no sideway, there's no fast path, there's no sidestepping around it. You have to go through it. And I felt very alive when I was doing this documentary, when I was talking to these people. More than when I was talking to them, I mean, I was kind of blown away by some of them because they were quite philosophical. One was highly academic. Like I think I can't remember what he studied, but I think he was at Oxford or Cambridge, and he was studying something like philosophy. and yeah, the fact that he MMA is brutal. I mean, it's pretty extreme, especially if you're not used to it, it's quite a challenge to kind of go into that world. But I was really taken by their mindset and the kind of philosophical approach that they had. But really what blew me away was coming across Ji-Jitsu. And he was talking like I would talk, really. And I had a certain inherent bias that, they're thugs, really. I mean, like, I people fight, right? And when they fight, you kind of have this assumption. I mean, martial arts, of course, Bruce Lee was my hero, and Muhammad Ali, and Jet Li, and all these kind of amazing kind of film martial artists I grew up on. But to really see these, everything that I've seen of UFC and MMA, I've always thought, okay, the people who go to that are perhaps not the audience that would come to mind, or to sadly spells for the Opera House, and that's probably true. But the people who do the martial arts, who are putting themselves on the line, where there's huge danger and risk, what's extraordinary is the question is why, and I started to understand why. It's different, but not as different as I thought it would be, to the reasoning of why somebody would want to go on stage to be vulnerable in front of 1,500 people. But what drew me was the mindset and the training. The practice is something I don't feel present in the dance world anymore. It's quite, when I'm doing jiu-jitsu and I in class, I see that there is no cheat. You can't get away with it. It will take time. It doesn't matter if you're athletic, that helps a little bit. But knowledge is knowledge, and embodied knowledge and practice knowledge just makes you better. That's it. Yeah, I went into jiu-jitsu thinking I would do all right because I'm very athletic. I mean, fuck it. I've trained for 10 hours a day. I'm going to be fine. It's quite the opposite. I was completely blown away by how just inadequate I was, and how humbled. I was humbled, to put it that way. I was beaten to be humble. Because you get to a certain stage as an artist, because you've done it for so long, hours and hours, that you just become specialized at it. But that doesn't mean you can transfer that skill easily into another form. For me personally, it was a hard transition, but I find great pleasure in drowning, and I feel people have lost that will to find the pleasure in drowning. And you have to find the pleasure in drowning. I mean, otherwise, why the hell would you ever want to be smashed every day in jiu-jitsu?
Yeah, I think that you know, the thing about failure and about vulnerability, like that's what really resonates for me about martial arts as well, like, and particularly like live practices like sparring and grappling, is that continual encounter with failure. I think that's like so important. And I think you're so right that like we live at in a moment where failure is kind of considered a bad thing and we're supposed to like protect ourselves from it, but like we also can't create without failure. Like it's not possible. It's not possible to create
Absolutely.
artistic work, you know, to write, like none of it is possible without failure. So I always feel like that's a really important life lesson that I get
Yeah.
from martial arts and jujitsu in particular, because
Yeah.
jujitsu you have to fail so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing is people don't really know until you do it. People
Yeah.
have no clue what failure means until the extent of failure. They're going to go for years and years and years. I mean, how much willpower and desire, you know, there's a certain, it builds, there's a certain, you know, what do they say? A black belt is just a white belt who never gave up, right?
Right.
That's all it is, right? It's just a white belt that just never, ever gave up. And one thing that's really interesting, my father passed away last year, and I had a very challenging relationship with my father as opposed to my mother. So my mother was the one who, my father was as a mantra every day, kind of, I don't know why I mean, there's so many reasons why he did it. But, you know, as a child, when I was a child, the moment I could understand language, he would whisper in my ears that you're going to be a failure. I think he was very unhappy in his own life. So, I mean, to say that on a daily basis, the confidence, lack of confidence that grows, it's like a cancer that grows in one's mind as a child growing up, thinking your father believes that you're a failure. On the other hand, though, my mother would whisper, those who think you're a failure fear what you can be if you persist. And so I had this contradictory messaging on a daily basis, I would say for years, until I was about, I would say, 13. And then I went to work with Peter Brook. So I just kind of went, you know, off. And then my father changed his mind and felt a bit more proud of me. But up till about 13, it was really a really tough growing up. So, you know, what I'm trying to say is my persistence is always, my failure can't cope with my persistence. Put it that way. So that's been ingrained in me because the more my father thought I was a failure, the more I believed in my mother that actually I'm just not going to give up. But, you know, I feel also in dance, I agree with you. There is a generation of entitlement where everything has to be protected and nothing is about going to the threshold. What I love about jiu-jitsu is I feel like I'm going to the threshold. Of course, in a professional dance, when I'm working with my dancers, they're handpicked because I know they're wanting to go to the threshold. When you're in the comfortable place, the humanity isn't, who you are isn't revealed. The moment you go past that threshold, the moment you go to the uncomfortable, the unknown, the point where your technique starts to flay, starts to collapse because you're going at such an extreme place, that's when you discover who you are. And I always feel people think theater is about illusions. And for me, theater personally, because of Peter Brook and Aryan Mushkin, theater for me has not been about illusions. It's about revealing the truth. It's actually quite the opposite. I think life is full of illusions. I feel like we're living in a false sense of everything. The only time I find truth is the moment your body is in not in crisis, but in a place where it's close to falling off the edge, you know.
Mm. Yeah, it's so interesting that like the point about truth, because I think that's, well, true about a lot of martial arts, particularly like high contact based martial arts, where it brings you, there is no way but through it, like what you've said, and
Yeah,
it brings you into this great elemental encounter with another human being where you're coming up against, yes, you're competing against somebody, and you're contesting them, but you're also coming up against yourself and your
yeah,
own vulnerabilities.
yeah.
There's this amazing quote from the kickboxer Benny the Jet Urquidez, and he talks about like when you're sparring and you're starting to get triggered by that, it's that person, he's a kickboxer, so he's talking about, he's like, those kicks, the way they're landing, it's not that they're landing on your body, they're landing on your psychic wounds.
Mm,
And it's not them who's kicking you anymore, it's the harm that the world has done to you. And he calls it
yeah,
woundology, like turning towards your own vulnerability. And like that just sort of like blew me away, because I was like, yes, that is the whole thing with like sparring. I think particularly jujitsu in a way, because it's like you're in such close contact with another human being, and often you're just like, when you're a beginner in particular, and I'm a relative, I'm a blue belt, so I'm not like a highly accomplished person in jujitsu at all. So I end up in this situation often where I'm like crushed or stuck, or and that moment where you're like, I'm stuck now, all there is me, in a
yeah,
way, like the other person has occasioned my stuckness, but I have to figure
yeah,
that out. I have to figure out my way out of it. And so there's such a kind of core truth to that. And I think, you're right about it. Like it activates our humanity in a really fundamental kind of way.
yeah, yeah. And I feel also actually, to be honest with you, I feel stuck so much as well as a blue belt. I'm telling you, it's like such a long road. Um, but it's amazing how just how when you become specialized in something, you feel that it's transferable. And I think certain skills are transferable, for sure, a mindset. But I think the biggest difference is you're up against yourself as a performer. You're not, there is contact work, but it's not on the level as jiu-jitsu. The knowledge you need of contact work is, and your aim is, your goal is something else. In contact work in dance, it's to create something in harmony, with push and pull, of course. In jiu-jitsu, it's exactly the opposite. It's to use harmony against the other person. So to pull them towards you as if they're winning, and then you trip them and take them in a different direction. It's very strategic, but in the end, it's to dominate. It's to win. So there's you and there's the other person. Whereas when you're in dance, it's just you really, in harmony. So yeah, I struggle a lot with with the mind. There's some mindset, part of my mindset that is about consistent training. I'm obsessed.
Mhm.
That has shifted. That has kind of bled through my Indian classical training, my dance training. So that discipline is going to be there in martial arts. When I started jiu-jitsu, I do it on a daily basis, morning in my studio, with Bob. Bob is just a doll, or whatever you call them, a jiu-jitsu doll. Very heavy, actually, very lazy. He doesn't do anything. I have to lift him and do stuff. But I think the biggest shift for me was that I have to win.
Mm.
If I try to win, I keep talking to my teachers about this. If I try to win, I feel I'm showing off,
Interesting.
because there's a deep part of me that feels most people below blue belt and below, even close to purple belt, I can take on, because I'm so confident in my dynamic and my rhythm. But I will never know, because my mind pulls back. And actually it's about being graceful. And the thing is, you're not getting any further. You're not learning if you're not pushing. And you're not helping the other person because you're not pushing them as well. You're not pushing yourself, you're not pushing them. So when it comes to drilling, it's fine. When it comes to sparring, something stops me from going for it. And that's where I've been struggling a lot. And that's interesting but I think what's interesting, that's my personality. I think it took me years. Even as a dancer, I was very shy on stage. And it took me years until I knew the form so well that I just exploded. I hope that happens one day in Jiu-Jitsu. It might never happen, but yeah, it's interesting how you rediscover your personality.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think I had sort of the opposite issue with Jiu-Jitsu, not
Right.
necessarily that I'm hyper competitive, but that I was like, ah, and just like wanted to throw myself at the situation, and it was a very long journey for me of realizing like how easily someone can use that against me. And I actually, it started with boxing where my first boxing coach was like, it's good that you're so aggressive, but it makes you really easy to hit. And I was like, wow, oh, I thought I was supposed to be aggressive here. Wow. And then realizing like, no, the whole point is like to manage that. And then with Jiu-Jitsu, weirdly, I didn't fully transfer that insight over somehow. Because it's so close, it feels like it's just about like grabbing onto somebody and moving them around. And, everyone's like, oh, it's the gentle art. And I'm like, how gentle can it be? You're choking each other out and your people are like crushing you and stuff. But the more I've learned about it, the more I've started to realize like within the scrum, people who are really good. And I'm even starting to be able to see this, like where you move someone one way to get them to move the other way. And that's like that harmony thing in a way. It's kind of like instrumentalizing harmony. But it's interesting how deeply embedded it is in the practice, because it is like a competitive sport.
Yeah. It was interesting because I remember, I think it was John Danaher, when he spoke about the coach who spoke about the technique, and it was very similar to what I talk about in dance when I'm looking at a phrase. More than technique, actually a choreography. So in Jiu-Jitsu, it's a multiple choreography, right? And you just literally you chain one phrase into another phrase into another phrase, and the better you get, the more seamless and quicker you can chain phrases together or sequences together. But what was interesting was they were talking about I think it was John Danaher who was talking about 3 points in a phrase, and that's exactly the way I see movement. What I look for in movement, one of them is angle. What angle that phrase, and what angle do you exit that phrase for it to be interesting? And for John, I think it was John Danaher. Let's assume it was John. One of the coaches said the angle is very important because the technique can work and not work depending on the angle. The other one is pressure. Where do you put the pressure? Which point of the body or of the phrase, when is it that you put the pressure? If you put it too early, it doesn't work. If you put it too late, it doesn't work, which then leads to timing. So the pressure point, angle, and timing. And that's exactly what I look for in phrases. I ask those questions. Which angle do I enter this phrase? Where do I put the emphasis, the pressure, and the rhythm of it? How do I make this interesting by either slowing it down in the beginning and speeding it up? So it's really interesting. I mean, Jiu-Jitsu for me is like, because actually I put on music and people put on music, right, in the gyms, but nobody hears it. And that's really beautiful. It's mute, actually, because all you're hearing is the reaction and the conversation that the opponent is giving you. The moment I start listening to Jay-Z or whatever is on, in the studio, I'm not present. What it forces you to do, Jiu-Jitsu, is to be in the present. And that is the one thing that is similar to being on stage. It awakens the five senses. Because before I come on stage, over the last 10 years, I've been struggling a little bit personally to get on stage. I've done hundreds of shows, but every show I spend, it's usually 2 hours before the show, I'm freaking out and I get stage fright. And 10 years, I would say 7 years, actually. Yeah, 7 years. And since 2015, so yeah, 7-8 years. And I've been trying to find excuses, literally in the dressing room, going, okay, if I tell the presenter and I make something up, like my leg is injured, I can cancel the show. I literally make as a ritual, I make an excuse in my head, but I don't go through with it. Sometimes, actually, to be honest with you, I have gone through with it twice. So I've cancelled 2 shows with a lie. But I cancelled once Sadler's, a London show, and another show. I won't say the other place, but anyway, but that's how serious I am. I'm so freaked out. And after a while, I realized what was interesting was the moment I got on stage, everything disappeared, all my excuse. Because before I'm on stage, I'm thinking about the past and I'm thinking about the future. What went wrong? What could I have done better? Am I going to fail? The future, am I going to make a fool of myself because I'm older? Will people think I'm slow? Will people think I'm not flexible? Will people be disappointed by the piece? All my vulnerability is in the past and the future. The moment I step onto stage, I become a monster. Monster in the sense that there is nobody but me, and I believe so much in what I'm doing. And what I realized is I'm in the present. The stage forces you to be in the present. And that's the one thing that I feel also in Jiu-Jitsu. I don't know if you feel that too when you're in Jiu-Jitsu. The music just disappears. It's just the music of the body that you're competing with.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I call it like the world disappearing, and like how amazing, like particularly anything that's sparring based, it's like literally there's no, the space goes away, like you say, the music goes away, like the other people who are training or who are grappling, like you lose consciousness of the fact that they're there. And so it's like that like state, like the being in the flow state in such a kind of intense sort of way. And it is really analogous in many ways to being on stage, and to just like that moment of like nothing else exists. And it's so extraordinarily freeing to have that. Like I feel so lucky actually to have that in my life.
Yeah.
And I think it keeps me going back,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, don't you feel like I feel with my kids, we've lost the art of listening. I feel this new generation, I think my generation was losing it already. And I when I do jiu-jitsu, I feel the same as when I'm dancing, in the sense that I feel my parents' generation was a generation of we, myself and the other. That other can be God, that other can be something, but I was never alone. You were never alone. It was you in relation to something you believe in. We are now a generation of I. I always say, like, if you think about in the last 2 decades, we've had iPads, iPods, iMac, iTunes, iMovie, the common denominator being I. So somewhere down the line, there's been a shift between me and the other, whoever the other is, the thing that you love, to just me now. And so in that transition, I feel my children, like being silent is really hard for my children, and if you shift silent, silent, around, it's actually listen. You just have to switch the letters around. And the art of listening is lost in this new generation, because true listening happens when you stop waiting to speak. And for me, it's really I send my kids to jiu-jitsu now, privately and in class, because they start listening. They have no choice but to listen because the other person's coming at you. And then my children woke up and thought, so I can feel them zone in. And that's really beautiful. I feel like jiu-jitsu has allowed us to, as a family, well, my kids and myself, to relearn how to listen again.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, right, you have to work with what's there, not what you're thinking is there or what you want to be there or what you imagine could be there. Like, you have to work with what the person is giving you. So that is like a really useful like object lesson and like kind of metaphor for like verbal listening, because it's like it's so, if you start layering things on top of it, like, I think this person is thinking this, or like, I bet they're going to do this, like it falls apart, like you results in certain defeat. Yeah, that is really, yeah,
because the body's, that opponent's giving you something, even by a shift of their weight. You don't listen to that. And I mean metaphorically, I mean, you don't listen to his body moving, shifting their weight. You're losing an opportunity. They're preparing for something.
Right, yeah.
I mean, also like listening to the invisible, the thing that everybody says, invisible jiu-jitsu. And I was like, what is that? And actually, when you start doing it, you go, yeah, there is this invisible jiu-jitsu. It's the part that you can't see. Opponents know what. It's such a revelation when you roll with a black belt, because you feel moving effortlessly, and they're doing stuff that you cannot see what they're doing. It's done with a little shift of a hip or a little shift of the wrist. It's so incredible. But the other thing I find also, what connects the stage and the mats, let's say, is, as I said, awakening the five senses. I feel like it's like going to a temple. Temples in the old days were built on hills, because there were originally, temples were built on, actually most places of worship were built on hills because of sight. And then usually you would go up the hill, you would touch the bells at a Hindu temple to awaken the sense of hearing. And then you would go inside the temple and you would touch the statue, the god, and to awaken the sense of touch, because the god was made out of a particular marble, stones, let's say. But when you go to bend down to touch the feet of the god, there's incense to awaken the sense of smell. And as you leave, you're given prasad, which is taste, blessed food, to awaken the sense of taste. So whenever I'm doing jiu-jitsu, I'm smelling the person, I'm touching the person, I'm seeing the person, I'm hearing the person. It's awakening the five senses. Deal with technology, and not that I'm against technology, unless I don't have a problem with technology, except when technology controls you. So I feel more and more my children going into this, like they're getting warped into the iPad, and they disappear into it's a epidemic. It's a pandemic. It really saddens me. I mean, that 9, 8, and 9 months. So the 9 months hasn't got there yet, but the 9 and 8, it's incredible how I think we're going to be discussing this as parents many years later, because we were not prepared for it. And so I really feel martial arts is important now, because the body is the most important technology that we have still. And to embrace it, and it's so much part of our psyche. I don't know how you feel. I mean, why do you do jiu-jitsu? Apart from it being fun and that you're aggressive, you want to compete.
Right. That I have a strong competitive spirit. Yes. Well, fun is a huge part of it, for sure.
Yeah.
And I also, Bruce Lee was also my hero in the 70s. And I had this whole thing that I was going to learn Jeet Kune Do, and by the time I found some place where I could learn Bruce Lee's system, I was already I was already in my 40s. For me, I think I had dabbled in martial arts for a while. But when I started doing Jeet Kune Do, and it was kind of like Vale style sparring. It was like, full contact-ish, and like all fight ranges, all levels. And it was like just sparring, like it just opened up this whole world for me. And it was extremely fun. And I think fun is not something to be trivialized, and I think that's why what I ended up writing about is like, is fun enough to devote the equivalent of a full-time job to it? And my answer to that is like, it is, because fun's actually very complex, particularly like the distinction you're drawing between like this kind of fully immersive flow state experience that brings us into contact with our vulnerability in the other person's and lets us explore risk and the edge of pleasure and pain and care and violence. Like, that's a very different form of fun than like picking up the iPad and playing video games, or it's a very different kind of fun than like going to an amusement park and have somebody providing you your thrill and danger for you. And so like, I think for me, that was like, it was like life-changing, world-changing in a sense, that it was like that kind of space for exploration. And like, so far it doesn't get old, because it's like this deeper inquiry into that space, into the flow space, into like that exploration of the dynamic between two people. And I love what you're saying about it being a conversation, because even though it's competitive, it's like you still, if you want to like spar or grapple effectively, you have to really attend to your opponent, and you have to know, like, understand them and read them, and what you're calling listening, and like paying attention to where their weight shifts. And it's like if you completely ignore, who they are or what their thought process is or how they move, like you're not going to be able to do it effectively. And to me, that's so compelling. Like, it's just so incredible that something can be, rough and aggressive and competitive, but also on a certain level, there's like this really fundamental cooperation and understanding that like undergirds it. So,
I have to say, I was pretty amazed by the kind of kindness, that generosity that that people have on the mats. I suppose because they've been kicked the shit out of all the kind of ego. The ego's been, kicked out of them, if I can say that. But really, of course, you have the one or two who are like crazy people who come in and they just want to, and they don't have that kind of sense of play, or they just want to beat everybody because it's about them, etc. That's one or two. But most people, I was surprised how graceful most people were. And it's you know what it is. It's a kind of which I love so much, because it's very much the way I move in dance. It's never fully explosive. It's lightly held. And it's the restraint that gives it such power. So you don't go 100%, you go 99 or 98. And this I find very beautiful. In Jiu-Jitsu, I don't know other forms of martial arts. I think wrestling is quite the opposite. It's 100 and 110. That's what I've been told. But in Jiu-Jitsu, actually, it's never extending fully. Because the moment you go extend fully, you've got nowhere to go after that. So you always slightly to give just a little bit of breath, just in case you want to deviate and change. And so this concept is beautiful.
Yeah. Sorry, I got to.
No. That's all I want to say. Yeah. And I could relate to that, because in dance, that's exactly what I look for. It's the holding back. I was very virtuosic when I was young, and I got sick of it when people started saying, and then I realized at a certain point that that's how people are going to remember me. And I felt my goals were wrong. It wasn't about doing 100 spins super fast. How can I do one spin, but I can sustain it gracefully? So it's done in a way that's held. And that was much harder than to do 100. It's like watching an experienced dancer. The difference between an experienced dancer and a young dancer who's like super raw is the experienced dancer can manipulate thresholds, whereas the young dancer just goes 100%. And that's what I love about jiu-jitsu, especially the black belts. When I'm rolling with them, because I only train with predominantly. I mean, I went to class today, but really, I've been learning privately with a gi instructor and a no gi instructor, and they're both black belts. So whenever I'm just in awe of their grace, because to be honest with you, they can hurt me very easily. But it's more than about hurting someone. It's more about like a chess game, really. A mental stress, a chess game, a physical chess game. It's strategy, it's listening, it's multiple things. And what's beautiful about it is that you cannot see it. I keep saying it's not something you can see it, you can feel it. I don't know if James, if you've ever done jiu-jitsu, the moment somebody does it on you, that's the only time you'll realize that this is not it's not a scuffle. Because I assumed it was a scuffle. I assumed they're just fighting for the sake of fighting. Whoever's the bigger one's going to win. It's much, much more complex than that and nuanced. I don't know if you feel the same, Janet.
Yeah, totally. Yes, and like it's so interesting, like that point about like it's not about seeing it, and it's about responding to touch and sensation and like reading where someone's going to go. And I know I agree that I love training with black belts, and I sometimes get a little selfish, on the mat where I'm like, maybe can I maybe edge in and like train with this black belt, because like it's that thing, right? That like, yes, they have so much in their toolbox and they could cause such harm if they wanted to, and they're not, right? So that's part of it, that like what could be happening isn't happening. And that's such a beautiful to see that level of restraint, and that like the humanity and the compassion is amazing. But then like there is also that thing where like it's like I'm always struck by how when I'm rolling with a black belt, they are getting me to do all the work without my even knowing it, so it's like they're shifting and redirecting my energy, but with somebody who's really good but maybe a little lower level, like maybe a purple belt, like I can watch them doing it, and I can kind of observe like, oh, okay, I just crashed in and you got me an X guard, okay, I see that. Whereas like with a black belt, it's often like it takes me several minutes to realize like, oh wait, I'm doing all the work here, I'm running around, I'm trying to put my weight on them, and they keep avoiding it, so that I find incredible. And yeah, and like it does make you realize the over reliance on sight that
Yeah.
Is so habituated. And to have an opportunity to explore senses that are not sight is amazing too.
Yeah. Actually, to be honest with you, Extreme Combat, when I made that film, The Dancer or the Fighter, we never used the footage, but there was the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu master that was training one of the fighters that I was interviewing. That's the reason I kind of got into Jiu-Jitsu. There was a brown belt who was blind.
Oh, wow.
And he was incredible. So he said, why don't you just roll with him? I said, what does roll mean? Does it mean I just dive and make circles? And they're like, oh, you've never done this. I said, nope. And so he mounted me. I didn't even know what mount meant. And he said, why don't you try and, the teacher said, why don't you try and escape this brown belt? And I was like, but he's blind. I'm going to be able to escape. That's how naive and stupid I was, and pathetic. And and for about 6 minutes, 7 minutes, and then I just said, I just couldn't go anywhere. I didn't have any escape knowledge, but I would bump and bump and bump and use sheer force. But even when I got tired and I waited and I was trying to find a way, he was listening so carefully. I could feel his knees listening, and his elbows listening, but particularly his knees. Because he had mounted me, so on both sides of my hips was his knees. And I realized that he had antennas in his elbows, in his knees. He didn't need sight. It was the moment you touch him, you're in trouble. He can feel where you're going. And I have to say, I was humiliated, and at the same time equally blown away by the, yeah. So talking about no sight, I mean, this guy was a brown belt, and he really blew me away, I have to say.
Yeah, it is interesting, those moments that are like where you're like, wow, how does that person, how are they doing what they're doing? But I think that is so such a useful way of thinking about it, that there are like these, that touch becomes a form of listening, which is really, really fascinating.
I think it's really problematic. It's funny how we are okay with that in martial arts. It's problematic in dance.
Interesting.
We're not allowed to touch.
Yeah.
I'm not allowed to touch. As I tell all my teachers, you're not allowed to touch students. It's so complex. It's so complex now. So in America, I think it's even more complex, because there's I had to do these courses. It was really fascinating, actually. I learned a lot from asking permission if I can touch you. I was doing an opera. I was thinking of doing an opera, so we were doing some research, and with these young opera singers, and I said, look, how would they feel if we manipulated their bodies, or if one of the dancers manipulated the opera? And they said, oh no, you have to have permission. You have to take permission these days. And I said, oh my God, what world are we in? But that's the reality that we live in, because of all the bad things that go on too. Where people abuse the trust. And so there's a reason for why that happens, and I get it. But I feel sad that I'm not allowed to touch someone unless I go through proper channel. And yet in Jiu-Jitsu, we don't question it, and so I don't know, through touch, there's so much information that is passed on. So much information about your intentions, who you are, what you feel. And without that element in dance, it's so challenging. So I have to, apparently, the rule is that I have to tell my instructors, dance coach, that you're not allowed to touch any student in school. And the only way I learned dance was by touch. It was by, no, move your hand like this. No, feel this. This is the gesture. Look, and they would use my arm as a puppet to show me the feeling. It was mostly by touch. My guru taught me mostly by touch. He would speak, but very little. So it was a real shift, and that's why I kind of love the sense that we're the bodies are, you're learning, you're conversing through touch.
Yeah, that's interesting. With Kathak, that you did learn that. No, okay.
It's not.
Yeah,
it was my guru was very strict with positions, so he would really move my hand if it's wrong, or even Kumibahan, sorry, Kumudini Lakias in India, she would touch my hand of how to hold, but actually it's not very common. It is common in like places like Kalakshetra, for Bharatanatyam, in schools like that. Not always. It's really from a guru to a student or a disciple. I think in a class environment they don't touch so much. It's not very common. But my guru was very specific with me. Like, he used to show me how to turn, but then he would move my hand to whip. I learned so much by touch, I have to say. But that was a very specific kind of, and also Maven, my my right hand person. I mean, he's the creative associate of my company. He's also at the age of 11, he went and lived with his guru. It's a very specific way of living. It's a very particular lifestyle where you live with your guru. So you eat with your guru. You you sleep on the floor. He's sleeping on the bed. He might get up in the middle of the night and train you. I mean, Maven was a prodigy where I was not. He was already known as an 11-year-old in Malaysia that this is a prodigy, or a 10-year-old. And then he himself said, I want to go to that guru in India. Just take me there and leave me there. And she was like, what the hell? And she took him, and she asked the guru, really look after him, because this is our child. And she trusted him, and it was a risk, of course, but that relationship grew, and till the guru passed. But he was very hands-on, like how to hold your elbow, up, and not touching ever in a sexual way. It was really like a father to a child, or a mother to a child, But
yeah,
then,
it's interesting. Go ahead.
No, go.
Oh, because I trained in Bharatanatyam. I trained with one of Bala Saraswati's students, Nandini Ramani, and it was very hands off. It was, she sat on the floor and, be in front of her, and and she'd be calling things out. But actually that got me sort of thinking about like one of the things that I found, like I was trained in Bharatanatyam and in Cunningham technique, and so everything was very angular.
Yeah.
Like for me, the martial arts that came easier were things like Wing Chun Kung Fu or Filipino martial arts. It's a lot about angles. And for me, like Jiu-Jitsu with the 360-degree use of space was so confusing. And I was wondering if that might be less so for you with Kathak and release training, where you do everything's a little more curvilinear, and maybe you're used to a little bit more 360-degree use of space, or was it still confusing?
No, I think it's a really good question. I think for me, circularity was something that is very Kathak. But the Vaishnavism, the philosophy, the approach, love, devotees of Krishna, really. And devotees of Krishna was circular, because it was associated to love. So Kathak everything is circular, whereas Bharatanatyam everything is predominantly linear because of Shiva. And so, yes, the circularity was very, I would say, kind of easier for me in Jiu-Jitsu. So there was a common denominator, but the 360 is something I did not expect. Being upside down, my world just didn't make sense at that time. Inversions, that took me a while, I have to say. I was like, this is like breakdance. I mean, but to see the world upside down, I mean, fully 360, to be honest with you, that's what Jiu-Jitsu is. I would say Kathak is circular, but definitely 180 degrees, no more than that.
Yes. Yeah. And even release technique, is it still, I mean, it's not as I guess it's not, maybe it's like 270 degrees, but probably not.
Yeah. You know what's really interesting is release technique, Kathak, it's all for show. In the end, it's for the fourth wall.
Yeah.
It was not for show. There is no fourth wall. It's and that's another thing that really struck me, is it doesn't matter how it looks. I mean, some of it looks ridiculous, to be honest with you. If I was looking at it from a dance perspective, butt scoots, it just looks, what's the point? You only realize later that every single thing that you do has a intention that can save you, or that can help you attack. It's not for beauty, or whereas release, all these techniques fundamentally are for show, really.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think often, like, even as somebody who's has a bit of experience with jiu-jitsu, like when I'm taking a break and other people are grappling, like sometimes I find myself just looking at them being like, it looks like they're doing nothing. And you have to like look really closely to actually see like the shift of weight, and where somebody's going for a submission and someone's defending. And so, yeah, and actually there's a whole thing with like the history of jujitsu and the UFC and how they've like changed the rules. They keep changing the rules over time because jujitsu is just not telegenic enough, and it's not spectacular enough that like fans will get bored because it's
Yeah.
like you're just watching go around.
Yeah.
And so I think that really speaks to your point, right? It's not flashy in any way, and it's not, and yet it's like, it's funny because it's such elaborate movement. It's functional, but it's like some of it is so elaborate,
Yeah.
where it's like this way to move this way, and then you grab this ankle, not that ankle, and it's so precise, and sometimes it's so technically nuanced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I find I feel more and more that I think the dance schools would really benefit from jiu-jitsu if it could become a part of their if I had a dance school, that's the first thing I would put in. Apart from the dance classes, I would make jiu-jitsu compulsory. That's how important I think. But I can't implement that right now because I mess around with my dancers. So I give them class, whatever little I know. And we get the jiu-jitsu mats out and we do class. But at the moment, my biggest struggle is, how do I use jiu-jitsu? How do I use it in dance? And I can use some of the material, but what I'm doing is basically visualizing jiu-jitsu. I'm just making it a spectacle. The patterns that I'm creating are inversion, X, single leg X, drop them, stand up, pass the guard, take the back, and I'm doing it. I'm asking them to do it beautifully. There's no understanding of, I say there's always a PhD with each guard. It literally is a PhD. You have to, and I'm not joking, and you know that. And it's so much to just understand one guard. But I'm just going through the motion to create a choreography. So my intention is different. But other than that, I don't know if jiu-jitsu can benefit the dance yet because I've just started. What I do know is my body has become much, much more flexible and stronger and resilient since I started jiu-jitsu, because my body was breaking down. I'm 48, but my body was breaking down by doing the solos, extreme solos like Xenos, which is an hour and 10 minutes or whatever. And then over the last year or 2 years, every time I've performed Xenos, the shock of the show is being absorbed by, it's like shock absorber. The body's become a shock absorber. It's like a car that has shock absorbers, when you go over bumps. So the number of bumps that I go over, it's quite challenging. So my body's broken after every show. So I have to go to the ice bath. It's immediately there in the, straight after a show. And I'm there for like 10-15 minutes because I'm doing hot and then cold. And then, the body it's pretty bad the next morning until I open the body up. But by doing jiu-jitsu, everybody, Maven even said, somehow I've just got much, much more stronger. And so I would implement, if I could, I would implement jiu-jitsu for everyone, every dancer. And it's not, because there's one part of it that's important. It's important that it's not about show.
Yeah.
Dance training is based predominantly on a mirror.
Yeah.
The mirror is always there, not for actors, but dance, yes. You need the mirror because you need to find the line. So it's always visual. So to counter that, I would say jiu-jitsu is important.
Yeah. Yeah. That is really interesting. Yeah. Like, I was struck by that when you're talking, but like, I'm really struck by how, jiu-jitsu in particular, I think, and like, martial art combat sport generally, I found it so rejuvenating And so even though it's like, it's rough and sometimes it's dangerous and like I get contact injuries, like I really don't get non-contact injuries anymore. Because there is something that is so regenerative about the practice.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is like very biomechanical. It's just like, you have to have incredible stamina. It makes you very strong. It makes you strong in places that like maybe we would tend to neglect in other ways. You need to be limber. But I do think there's also something about the kind of energetic flow between two people that happens in grappling, and also the kind of intense flow state that is, it goes back to the thing we were talking about, that having those moments when the world disappears is
Yeah.
just so generative. Like,
Yeah.
and I think it actually can be really transformational.
Yeah. I completely agree. I mean, yeah, I don't think, I wish I'd started jiu-jitsu earlier. I wish it was part of my training when I was young. I think it would have had a huge, maybe, 10 years on, if I'd done it already for 10 years or 15 years, I think I would have been able to kind of dissect it and use certain parts of it that could be useful for dance, apart from it being strong. But right now I'm at such a baby stage trying to just make sense of the world of jiu-jitsu. Yeah, it's a fascinating experience, but I love the sense that you said it's so rejuvenating and kind of, as I said, it's awakening the five senses.
Yeah. Well, I just realized we've been talking for about an hour, so I'm wondering if I should let the UK people, you two UK people, have your night. As much as I'm enjoying this, and I'm like, I could talk for another hour, but yeah,
Is there
I don't
anything
know.
that you feel like we should cover?
I've been kind of practicing the art of listening through this, knowing when to kind of pay attention. There is one thing I've been just kind of picking up from what you've been saying that would be cool to hear about is it seems like this really great excuse for intimacy. And there's like, when you're talking about this kind of listening through the body and through touch, and it's just fascinating me, this relationship between your interlocutor, the person that your opponent, the person you're opposing, and having this wonderful intimacy at the same time. It's that kind of two sides of the same coin. And when you're talking about having jiu-jitsu and dance training, having that kind of connection, being able to have touch, being able to have that real full sensory listening. I was just wondering what it is about the situation of like an encounter in jiu-jitsu that allows that kind of intimacy to happen. It seems a kind of paradox in my mind.
For me, it's a complete paradox. I mean, it's funny that we use the word intimacy. I mean, it is so intimate, and at the same time, that is not the word that comes up because you're fighting for survival.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about fighting for survival that I think we've also lost because everything is safe in our lives. We know where to get food. We don't have to fight for it. We know that we have shelter. It's a privilege, right? The hunter-gatherers had to fight for survival all the time. And that element is lost, yet it's intimate. So whenever one associates intimacy, there is something naturally, not naturally, but by default, people think there's something sexual about it. But it's far from being sexual. Yeah. It's completely life and death. Yeah. I don't know, Janet, how do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like life and death when you're in it, even though I know that there are all these rules and it's a game, and like, if it's so different from real world violence in like all sorts of ways, and not least because there are all these complicated rules, but at the same time, like, it does feel like I think there's something about sport fighting that like it both has this like, this is play, this is edge play, you know, and you could be really absorbed in it at the same time that a little part of your mind feels like this is a life or death struggle, you know? And so I think, and that's often what we're playing with there, is that little part of it that like feels like it's a real fight. And we're kind of bracketing it. And so, right. And so, and I think in some ways, like it becomes like, it's such an exploration of the other person and their mind and their way of thinking. And at the very same time, there's something that becomes very distant. So it's like, it is intimate in that way. And yet it's like almost the opposite, because it's very like, they are rendered a neutral body in a sense. They're rendered just a neutral set of limbs doing things. And it doesn't matter like who they are or whether I know them or not, or, you know, all the factors that go into what we think of constituting a person. And yet I think there is also another thing that is really intimate about it, which is that when you train with someone a lot, you start to recognize their repertoire. And then they have their moves, and they know your moves. And then that's where the chess game starts to get complicated, because it's that like, they know that I know that they know, you know, and it sort of becomes this like very complicated mapping of somebody else's psyche at the same time that you know that they're mapping yours, and that's constantly moving. So it is a really deep inquiry into how other people think and how their minds work.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you both so much for giving so much of your time. I really appreciate both of you. It's been a real privilege for me to kind of sit in and listen, and kind of I have so many thoughts sparking off from that. So I really appreciate